controlling class is not interested in having people understand this because, first of all, this leads to the causal factors, the understanding of the causal factors about why humanity is in the current conditions that we're in. Many people will have no answer for that. They don't understand the causal factors.
Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on the 10th of March 2019. Because we live in such nonsense today, don't we? That's how bad it is, because there's a big agenda and the folk literally, the people have no idea at all, I mean really at all, even the ones who think that they've looked into it in any kind of detail, they have no idea how old and how all-encompassing this agenda is. It's everything for the ones who control the world. It's going for broke, basically. We'll be broke, they'll win. But that's how it all works out, you see. Very ancient agenda. And they couch it in all different kinds of terms, and world orders, and globalism, and global governance, and global government even. There's even articles in different papers talking about, is it time for global government? They keep floating the trial balloon, getting you used to the idea. It's quite something to see, actually, and to live through it. But folk have no idea, because we were taught just to accept things as they are. And anyone who knows what's going on, who doesn't belong to the elite, are obviously conspiracy nuts. That's what they'll call you see. That term itself was put out by intelligence agencies after the death of Kennedy back in the 60s. To ridicule anybody who just point out so many inconsistencies in the Warren Commission's report. And it works awfully well. The public, it's so sad, isn't it? How things work out so uniformly, repetitively well for the elites. It's like the mob in ancient times, or the Middle Ages, say, when someone was going to get their head cut off by royalty for some reason or another, like Henry VIII's period, for instance, and people would go to it, and it was like a kind of fair thing for them, because that was the most entertainment they generally got in their lives. And there would be jesters going around the crowds, like jokers. They would sell things at these fairs, basically. And they'd all see their blood and guts and go back going, ooh, just like a horror movie. And it was just too easy for the proclamation read by whoever was speaking on behalf of the Crown, reading out the sentence as to what they did, even though even the public in their subconscious knew these people didn't do that, anything like this, whatever it happened to be. But that was good enough for them, and nothing's changed. Today's just a conspiracy theorist. Who says so? Someone in authority of the government says it's a conspiracy theory. But that's what you get, isn't it? Because you get counterintelligence, which is counter to intelligence. That's what counterintelligence means. And all the spy agencies have them. Your government has internal and external agencies dealing with that, and internal ones deal with the people inside the country. It's astonishing, but just like the crowds and ooh, as the axe comes down after the reading of the verdict and the reason for it, they're just the same today as they were then, really. Well, yeah, conspiracy, not yeah. And that's what they'll label anybody who comes out with, even if you're reading official articles from the government. Isn't that astonishing? Isn't that amazingly astonishing? You can read them from the government's own websites and departments and agencies. And people will still class you as a conspiracy nut because you have some strange inquiry, or you've made a strange inquiry into finding out in the first place. That means you're nuts, you see. Because they would never think about looking in the first place. They'd rather not know. That's the difference. So anyway, this is part 3. It wasn't going to be a 3-part thing on eugenics and the plan, the big agenda. It's a big agenda. You heard Bush Sr. at the time, when he was the president, talking about a new world coming into view, a new world order. His son said the same thing about 10 years later exactly. It's quite fascinating to live through this and watch it and hear it all happening in coding that the public don't understand. What do you mean a new world order coming into view? Coming into view. Whose view? Whose world order? Who planned it? And even with terms like it's ancient and things like that. Ancient plan. What ancient plan? Did you know you're part of some ancient plan? Did you know that? It's really something, isn't it? So this is going to be part 3, as I say. Because last week I covered a lot of stuff from eugenics too, and to touch on geoengineering and so on, and the different humanistic so-called sciences that are part of this agenda to train the public into behaving in certain different ways and believing certain things too, which perhaps they shouldn't. So this is part 3 of Witness Signs of Huxley Blair's Ultimate Revolution, using geneticists, biochemists, and scientific collusion. And that we've got to give up all our rights and freedoms to save the world from global warming. So that's what we're living through, farcical systems of control. But as I say, the big boys planned this a long time ago. As I say, this is like months and months now. I haven't had time to even work on much at all. In the intellectual sphere, it's mainly on the physical sphere of clearing the snow. You've got to understand what we're living through, a big agenda. It's all around you. It's in all the symbols. It's always written in symbols. Because at one time, when religion ruled in, say, the Western world, and people were religious, which gave them their culture and a way of life so that they could at least help each other out. And when you didn't have welfare systems and welfare states, and you had famines and things like that and bad crops, people helped each other out. It was utterly necessary to have a cohesive religion with its commandments of helping each other out, basically, and looking after people as you would look after yourself, basically. And of course, the enemies of all of this that use different terms, including reason, of course, cloak themselves in societies, behind societies, that would use terminology that would sound vaguely religious. Sometimes they would sound as though they'd taken things from, say, the holy books and so on. But in reality, they've got their own version of what it all means. And you'll find down through the ages that Lucifer is the hero, of course, of the particular groups that all flourished from the same one group long ago. Lucifer really stands for intellect, intelligence, reason. Today, secular humanism too, of course, they have, it's the same kind of thing. But it is a religion, a belief system that man's ability, through his brain power, his intellect, and so on, he can make a utopia on the world and run things the way that it should be run, according to those who want to rule it all, and who probably all do today, in fact. Under the guise of science, they try to validate all the different things that they have to rule over you with by using all these different sciences and using academia that you don't vote into any office, of course. And we're living in an age where everything's appointed over you. It's appointed by governments to pretend that they're yours, but they've got nothing to do with you, in fact, except you pay them too much, in fact. But that's the way it is. But in the Middle Ages, and even beyond, right up to not too long ago, that they couch their terminology so that they didn't get found out as subversive of a system. And don't forget, up into the 1800s, especially in America, people would turn on anybody who wasn't blasphemed their religion. Blaspheming had a bigger attack, basically, focus on your whole culture, everything that kept you all working together and surviving together. That's really what it was. Bit by bit, it's been chipped away, especially through the 20th century, and with massive wars and causing massive slaughter that achieved many goals for those who were taking the world over, because they had to put you into shock. They had to make you ask silly questions like, why does God allow the wars to happen? But if you've got free will, man can be guided into wars quite easily by those who are rather evil. But the free will is free will. If you didn't have free will, you'd be a robot, which is what the other group want you to be, actually. A completely brainwashed robot, like Bertrand Russell wanted. Someone who you could train as a child and indoctrinate. Every belief, every thought that they had would be indoctrinated into them perfectly with scientific technique. And well documented. All my old talks have got this stuff in it. And remember, you can go into my archive section, cuttingthroughthematrix.com, because it goes way back. And every other talk show host out there and who covers any of this goes into my stuff all the time. including all the big shows, because why do the work when I've done it already? And they just reel it all off. And even the recent stuff annoys me too, because within the next few days you'll hear the top ones parrot off the stuff I've just put out a few days before. In the archive section, I gave lots of talks on what was called the occult, which is just hidden, of course. And even in ancient times, they had on say, Hebrew accompanying literature. They didn't just have it in their writings. They had many other writings too that accompanied the ancient traditions and ancient happenings. Myth, partial myth. What is myth? Myth is generally something you can't validate anymore, but so is most of history, isn't it? You'll find, I think it was Oxford University Press put out a good book on Jewish myths and legends. It was called, I believe, if I remember right. And they had awfully good stories in it if you really waded through it. And some of them were humorous, of course, and other ones touched on strange rituals that happened with certain sects that developed in the old Judea area, where one of the sects was pretty well exactly the same as the sects which developed in the Middle Ages in parts of, well, especially in France, parts of France, to do with the old Knights Templar stuff and all the rest of it that's been lumped into it. But they did have the same accusations that families and members of these groups would all go into these caverns or caves or underground passages, like a labyrinth thing, and they'd go through a ceremony, and lights would go off, get blown off, and they'd literally have sex with whoever was next to them. It didn't matter what gender it was either, supposedly, or even if it was their own kin. That was the same accusations that you find were given to not only Knights Templar groups that eventually moved into parts of France. Almost exactly the same, in fact. You find the rituals are so similar, very similar, to the Albigensians that lived in the southern France at one point too. And various Gnostic groups had very similar creeds of belief and behavior and culture in their systems, where the world was pretty well evil, which, you know, a lot of folk can't doubt that. But they actually said in Albigensians that they should attempt to dissuade children from growing up to have infants, and that can lead from one thing to the next until you have the ancient Greece philosophy. Basically, the Greek philosophy had infanticide. So that there's a lot more to it, naturally, than meets the eye, even though different groups are always stigmatized by powerful groups who win eventually over them down through time, and that's the same right up to the present day. But it doesn't go into who started it in ancient times or whatever, but it was fairly widespread in different across that area long, long ago. You also find old passages that were taken, they might be not taken out of the Bible, in some versions they might still be in them, but where those that take oaths and wink, you'll find it in actually the Old Testament, and shift their feet, because it's a symbol of the right angle. When you move your feet, you put them together in the right angle. Things like that, ancient, still used today, of course, in Masonic rituals. There's actually a warning about them, those who wink and shift their feet in certain angles and so on. And then they talk about the ephod. The ephod, it can mean a basket, but it can also mean an eye, a symbol of an eye. All old stuff. Anyway, I did that years and years and years ago, more than 20 years ago. To show you that there's definitely organizations that come down through time that hide what they're up to from the general public every time, every stage in their evolution, you might say, or existence. Because it's heretical in all ages and all types of cultures as to what they're up to, which is the overthrow of the current systems, especially the established religious orders, and all cultures, by the way, in order to destroy it all and bring in their secular humanism with themselves, and selected people who are tested on the IQ levels, no kidding you, and those in academia and specialists and so on, who would rule over you. And that's the perfect world that you find even in Things to Come, the story of it, from H.G. Wells, who was into all this stuff, eugenics and and population control, and they hated the rabble, the working class rabble, etc. And all his kin did too, all his friends, and the agencies that he belonged to, associations. So it's never changed, and they have to get their goal through. Now, the organization at the top already owns the financial systems of the world. That was one thing they had to do, was create a universal financial system. And it's central banks, of course. And all the central banks now are connected to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the Bank for International Settlements. These were all set up from the one organization. They did set them all up across the planet, same thing. Any country that wouldn't go along with it has recently been bombed out of existence, because you must borrow. You must borrow to be a part of the organization. And through the borrowing comes the demands on payment, and to get the money that you're trying to borrow for your nation, all the demands that you must implement social policies, which have caused even a bit of chaos in Africa over the years, when they start telling them what they have to decriminalize, you might say, in their society and on sexual areas and all that kind of stuff. So it's no longer an idea, it never really was, the idea of let's lend people to different countries that don't have much money. No, it's a social change policy for those who don't quite get it. And it's directed from the West. And the World Bank, of course, even has ex-prime ministers from Britain working in it now. So this is their system of control. Ireland too is in the same boat, Southern Ireland, because they were encouraged to borrow like crazy from the EU bank, the central bank there, you see, knowing it was all going to collapse on them. The guys knew years ago it was going to collapse, because that was the plan. And then they come in with the IMF branch to demand the payment, and they take over your system, and they tell you how much you can spend on healthcare and all that kind of stuff, and all the cutbacks you've got to go have austerity, in other words, at home. That's what it's going to be. And they dictate your social policies, you see. Maggie Thatcher had them in IMF and helped run the country when she was in office, because of the massive debt that had been accumulated by different governments before her too. So this is a system. Now, it is a secretive society, naturally, at the top, because you'll find out that none of the public voted for any of it, ever. You never got a chance to vote for any of it. The League of Nations was set up as a form of world government. That was the agenda. Well, H.G. Wells wrote about it, praising it, saying that the nation state is dead, and now we can have bureaucrats from the nation state directly working with departments in the League of Nations, because you'd have the equivalent departments in the League of Nations for everything. But it didn't quite pan out. People weren't ready to give up their sovereignty, so they had another world war. And he said that. He says, we need another war, because they haven't given up their sovereignty. So they use wars and everything to achieve many goals, and to take over much resources, because the guys at the top of this organization do believe they've got the right to manage all the resources and even own the resources of the planet. And they do pretty well through wars and conquest. Nothing's changed there. But anyway, they use this terminology of their goals. The new secular world order and expert-run world order. You'll find all the same terminology in all their writings from the Fabian Society group, which is just a branch of the Royal Institute for International Affairs. Whatever you're following out there, they run it. It doesn't matter what side you think you're on. I've gone through, in the last couple of weeks, some of the Huxleys, George Orwell and Huxley, through the letters that they corresponded with between each other, because George Orwell was living through an amazing time, 1930s, where literally everybody was so sick of this farce of either a kind of monarchical democracy, which is a farce in itself. They're completely opposing systems. You can't have both together, which tells you that one rules and the other one doesn't. You know? They were so sick of it, and the massive debts from World War I, and the debts imposed on certain countries because of World War I, that everything was falling apart. And it's true, the Paris Treaty, and the Treaty of Versailles, basically the Warburgs drafted up that Germany would have to continue to pay reparations to every nation, and it was pay off all their debts for the war to the year, I think it was 1979 or 1989. That was what they originally had on the particular agreement. Well, it wasn't an agreement because the Germans weren't asked to agree to it. I mean, they were just told. It was a complete farce. And the top reporters at the time for world newspapers said that this will lead to another war because obviously Germany can't afford to pay off everybody's debts. Never mind the fact that, believe you me, all the debt wasn't incurred by the countries just for the war either. It all went into big pockets at the top. Because we live in a crooked system. But anyway, they'd have to fight their way out of it, they said. Fight their way out. Or just get starved to death and die. That's exactly what they said. I was reading a diplomat's, a strange guy, about his biography. He was a Scots guy, but he became really the top negotiator in the 1930s and 40s and onwards, even up to the integration of the EU, part of that. But he was picked because of his fluency in languages. They got him into the right societies and, of course, the right oaths, etc. And so he knew the agenda, but it was fascinating to read bits of his life. Because any big meeting at an international level for foreign affairs, he was there in charge of it, generally, for most of his life. And it was astonishing to see how they work feverishly, never stopping, all the different organizations that you never vote for, to push their own agenda through for a world government. The same world government that Karl Marx talked about. A unified Europe as a trading bloc under a single parliament. And a unified Americas under a single parliament. And that was discussed during the NAFTA meetings, by the way, the last NAFTA meeting, not the last ones, but the ones in quite a few years back. I kept articles and I read it on the air when I was on a radio show. Anyway, Orwell's idea was that this incredible militarization during the 20s and 30s, because the governments were all falling apart and nations were falling apart through poverty and reparations, and not just Germany, every country was. Britain had massive taxation on the public because of the war debts. Because you always pay for everything for the elites, you know, you pay for their costs, you put railroads in across the world as an empire. The public pay for all that, they staff it all, they pay for the armies and so on. They get the bills for everything, but they get nothing back to actually say profit-wise for themselves. But the ones at the top certainly do. This oligarchy, they call it, whatever it is that runs your government, above the government, of course, naturally. And that's how it is. So Orwell brought 1984 out, published I think in 1947-48. In it, it was mainly because at that time the Soviet system really was a test. It was the second experiment. They called it the Great Experiment. The first one was an American experiment to see if they could govern themselves. The general people, that is, the public. That was the idea behind it. And if they couldn't, then the society that formed it would rule them secretly from behind, you might say, you know, or above them. They wouldn't know it. They still think it was the same kind of government as if they failed to manage to look after themselves. Well, it's easy to destroy a culture so they can't look after themselves and point to all the problems they've got and say, "Law CCC," and then they start appointing agencies to manage you. And so they end up in the same, eventually they end up the same way as the Soviet Union. What we're living through today is actually the proper Soviet, you might call it. Because they ironed out all the problems by observing all the things that went wrong the first time with the Russian one, the Soviet Union. Remember, Soviet means ruled by councils. So there's under theory, which never worked out, but their theory was that you could bring in a system where all departments for labor would have their own council, their own panel to run it, you see. And all kind of unions would have their own governments as well. So a Soviet means ruled by councils. But in reality, in the Soviet system, naturally the head couldn't have any competition, so it would appoint the heads of the councils that were all party members and were bought and paid for very, very well. That's human nature, unfortunately, anywhere. It's too easy to bribe folk off. I've seen it happen in all countries, actually, bribes getting put across. So there's no shortage of folk who'll take the money and the bribes and really do the dirty on their fellows. No one's exempt from it. You'll find too that you see the Soviet system was to use science. They couldn't ever get to that stage, but to use science and proper scientific indoctrination in a Pavlovian style, conditioned responses and all the rest of it, where they'd all feel guilty when they were told to feel guilty, even if they'd done nothing wrong. And if you were to say counter-revolutionary to anybody, they'd immediately go into almost a paroxysm in a fit and turn all kind of colours. It was instilled in them. They're terrified of it. So language is very important. That's why they use language now. We're got language police in North America and across Europe, where now you're getting forbidden to say certain things. Same thing. It's all Orwellian. Well, Orwell saw this happening in his day, and so he saw a stage, at least for 1984, a stage where you would have the spy system, or everyone would get monitored, spied upon constantly, and as they got more and more authoritarian, they would demand that you turn up for, and I've mentioned this before, you will eventually have to turn up for your community meetings and community parades and community this and community that you will eventually, and if you're not there, you'll get a knock on the door and you'll get dragged out or fined or something. That will come in this system, this part of the system that we're going through right now. There's no doubt about it. In Britain, the police are contacting people who've used words they're not supposed to use anymore. And they get warned about it. So they're giving you a warning now. Well, that's a threat, you see. Your government agencies are threatening people. So you're already under tyranny, obviously, and it's not going to stop there. Not going to stop there. Because you see, your idea of freedoms are all delusions. Complete delusions. You really haven't had them. You really haven't. Because most of the things you do and say already, they were given to you to say and do. There's nothing out there. There's not a movement out there that doesn't have leaders supplied to you. Believe you me. That's why the system has never failed. It's never fallen apart. But if you go into this, for instance, here's an example. World government, There's so many articles, even from governments' websites themselves, about world order, a new world order, all that stuff. The stuff the general public will laugh at because you say it. You get from the government websites themselves and articles. But also world government. Ha ha ha, oh, you're probably talking about world government. Well, the Carnegie Council, these big foundations that run the thousands of non-governmental organizations that manage you all, that's the Soviet system. That's the new Soviet, you see, the perfected Soviet. You don't elect them. They all have the same goals in mind, but they have specialized parts of their agenda for themselves. And they're all funded by and paid for, and even have pension plans by the big foundations, tax-free foundations. So the Ford, the Carnegie, and Rockefeller, and many others. There's stacks of them out there, because it's one big club across the planet. And they have resurgent idea of world government. Oh, conspiracy. Where's that? Is that from the Carnegie Council publication and the journal? I think it was 22 SC001. It's all there, you see. So they have resurgent idea of world government. You see, it's maybe time for it. You find the Financial Times had it in it too. Is it time for world government? You've got Foreign Affairs, world government, and an illusion of world government, talking about they've not achieved the goal yet. There's just too many little arguments they're having to have the world government. So, but here it all is, from their own websites, world government. You've been used to for quite a few years hearing about governance, world governance, meaning, oh, that's not the same thing. Well, of course it's the same thing. You don't even need a building for world government. You just need to have organizations all working together, especially now with the internet, and ruling your life quite easily. Quite simple, isn't it? It's well in the way of what they want at the top. And it's always been this agenda, always the goal of taking over the resources of the whole planet, running it properly. What they actually say is finishing the creation. The builders, so they're the builders, they say. They take the material that was left unfinished, and it's their job to complete it and perfect it all. And so the symbology of the Tower of Babel, of course. And of course, we also know that's one of the main buildings they rebuilt, the ruined tower, for their annual EU meetings, of course. Or actually, they have it 3 or 4 times a year. That particular building is very symbolic. I mean, you couldn't get more symbolic than that, could you? But it's also the world itself. This deity left the world unfinished, didn't perfect man. Or maybe he made him immortal, but he changed his mind with the curse, basically, you see. But anyway, they claim the world's left imperfect. And so they want control of the weather, control of everything, control of the general population, control of the numbers of the populace, control of what they'll need and what they want, and elimination of that which they don't need. That's basically eugenics, right? Straight there, you see. It's all right there. There's nothing to guess at all. And the same organization that runs every other major organization, that created this one organization, did create the United Nations out of the League of Nations. They still want that to be a world government. They created the World Bank, they created the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements across for the whole planet. And basically, they're privately owned banks, but funded by us. How is that again? We pay for everything, this public-private idea. They take all the profits from everything, because it's their right to do so, because they rule the world, you see. And you don't vote for them, and we've got no votes to create the United Nations. We've got no votes from the public. Never mind their wars they give you. You ever get a vote for a war? Do you want to go to a... No, of course you don't get that. Never will either. Because the wars have different functions than the ones you're trained to think that they have. And as I say, H.G. Wells mentioned one of them, and that was to bring every country to its knees through mass slaughter, so they were so fatigued and terrified and horrified at the mass slaughter, and fatigued at the rationing that would come out of it, and half-starved, and which happened, by the way. Then in came the United Nations at the end of World War II, and they had all these articles. You see the old articles, old newspapers and so on, where they were planning to just establish themselves as a world government. But they still didn't get it. There was too much opposition from the general populace. And Wells said again, they need another war to bring them to their knees, on behalf of the Fabian Society and the elitists that he worked with. But Barry Goldwater also talked about it, and he himself was a senator for most of his life, I think. And like all politicians, there's corruption. You can't touch politics without corruption. So I don't trust any of them. At the end of his time, once he retired from it, he became left-wing and went along with all the left-wing agenda, all of it. You know, all the taboo things at one time, but he went along with them eventually. Rather strange, if you really have any principles. But he did say, he talked about the Trilateral Commission, which is a specialized branch that came out of the Council on Foreign Relations, this big branch that runs most of the world now. And its parent company in Britain, which is the Royal Institute for International Affairs, that used to be called the Lord Alfred Milner Group, because they ran the empire, this group, the secretive group, when there was an empire there. And then they passed the torch to America with a bigger tax base. They'd already plundered Britain until they were impoverished, malnourished with wars and rationing up into the 1950s, until most of the population, the working class, had rickets and goodness knows what else, you know. I'm not kidding you. But they passed the torch to America with a bigger tax base. Now, they had created a tax base in America, and that was all done with the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, all getting set up for World War I coming along. And along with it came the right to tax the public, you see. And so they could borrow as whatever they wanted from their these private bankers and private banks, and then the taxpayer would have to pay it all off, all the debt. That's the example of taking across the whole planet, starting in London to America and across the whole planet. Same organization. Goldwater did say in his book With No Apologies, he said the Trilateral Commission that really broke out into existence to the general public when Jimmy Carter came in. He was surrounded by them for the first time, and people said, what are these trilateral groups? What is this commission? This private group again, they're all private clubs. The CFR, you don't vote them in for anything, but they're running everything. And the Trilateral Commission really is the technocrats that are displaced everywhere to actually get jobs done, whether they're elected or not. They're just appointed everywhere across the world, and including the central banks. And two of them were appointed to look after Italy when they bankrupted Italy, and another one for Greece. Amazing, eh? So they can override every country's, or at least what they're not supposed to, but they simply do. I mean, who's going to stop them? They're appointed to take over your country when you're bankrupt again by the same banks that they work for. They're the movers and shakers, and their ex-prime ministers, ex-presidents belong to it. Bush Senior was one, and they're not beholden to the public for anything. Anyway, see, here's what Goldwater said in the book. He says the Trilateral Commission is intended to be the vehicle for multinational consolidation of the commercial and banking interests by seizing control of political government of the United States. Seizing control of political government of the United States. There's some part of that you don't understand there. You don't elect these people, they're appointed everywhere until they are running your governments. And they're in all parties, because the parties are all a joke. Anyway, he says, in my view, the Trilateral Commission represents a skillful and concerted effort to seize control and consolidate the four centers of power: political, monetary, intellectual, and ecclesiastical. The Commission emphasizes the necessity of eliminating artificial barriers to world commerce, that's taxes and trade and all the rest of it, and import duties. It says what it proposes to substitute is an international economy managed and controlled by international monetary groups through the mechanism of international conglomerate manufacturing and business enterprises. What he's talking about here is what Quigley talked about, a new feudal system basically run by corporate CEOs, etc. This was in 1979 that Goldwater wrote that. And it says, freedom, spiritual, political, economic, is denied any importance in the trilateral construction of the next century. This is the one we're living in now. So remember, this was written about 1979. So freedom, spiritual, political, economic, is denied any importance in the trilateral construction of the next century. What the trilaterals truly intend is the creation of a worldwide economic power superior to the political power of the nation states involved. They believe the abundant materialism they propose to create will overwhelm existing differences. As managers and creators of this system, they will rule the future, rule the world, basically. Always the old agenda.